Hi, everyone. Hi. Thanks so much. Welcome to the first of our two panels on the theme of revolutionary constitutionalism. This panel is entitled Constituting Utopia, Instituting Revolution. And so thanks very much for coming. We really hope you enjoy them. And also, hello and welcome to everyone participating online at the Next System Convergence. So for the benefit of you in the room, these sessions are being streamed and recorded for a global event called the Next System Convergence, which is it's an action of activists and scholars globally who are participating in a wider process, which is about connecting social movements and communities who are working for system change with scholars of next system studies. And it is building towards a series of teach-ins that are happening in November. So if anyone is interested in organising one of these teach-ins, there is free support, consulting support to help you run it on your campus or in your community. So please just come and talk to us afterwards and we'll give you all the information. Okay. So we have three speakers today. The first of our speakers is Pier Giuseppe Puggioni. He has a PhD in legal theory and is a research fellow at the University of Milan Bicocca. He has a PhD, his PhD looked at legal pluralism and British socialism. And his recent book is about the philosophy of Harold Laski's legal theory in Italian.
I also read a paper.
To speak Italian.
Nice to meet you.
And his presentation is entitled Revolution as Institution, Legal Theory, Conflict, and Normative Project. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Karis. And thank you all for being here. And I wish to thank especially Simon and Karis for the organization of this panel. Okay, so the object of my, do you have 20 minutes to present?
Minutes, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so the object of what I will be talking today is to inquire into the concept of the category of revolution from a legal conceptual perspective, which means in some sort of a way considering revolution as a legal category. So in the first place, I will try sketching the traditional theoretical approach to this topic, and then I will try to show some sort of alternative through the concept of institution that you could guess from the title, Revolution as Institution. The question I'm starting from is as follows. Is it legally or technically appropriate or even logically possible to address a revolution as a part of the juridical discourse? So this question, although it might appear, it is far from trivial, because although the revolutionary phenomenon, let's say the fact of revolution, has been always indubitably relevant to appraise the generative process of the formation of laws and institutions, most of part of the legal literature has approached and still approaches the concept of revolution as something external or, let's say, alien to the legal domain. In fact, eminent legal theorists have taken revolution into consideration just to devise a sort of separation and opposition between the law and the revolutionary phenomenon. And the origin of this view, I would say, is in the early modern political theory. Let's take, for example, Hobbes. So the opposition between as all of you know, the opposition between the civil commonwealth and the state of nature is, in fact, the opposition between the civil constitution and the civil war. So the state of nature is nothing but the idea of civil war. So it's something that is opposed to the juridical positive discourse. And this sort of theory had much success, especially in the 20th century. If we take Hans Kelsen, in especially the General Theory of Law and State, 1944 or 45, we can read that revolution in general is something that happens when a legal order is annihilated or replaced by something else, by another, in an illegitimate modality, due to an illegitimate process, which means the process is not following the rules that are replaced or dismantled. And this makes the revolution, in the first place, an external event to the legal order, something that comes from the outside. But somehow, interestingly, it also seems to be the tie between two legal orders. There are one replacing the other, but the revolution itself is not a part of the legal order, because it is something in between. And a similar view was proposed by an Italian theorist that, I don't know if you've heard about it, it's Norberto Bobbio. It might be quite popular. And he also proposed this view of the revolution as something that dwells in the middle of the legal discourse, but it's not part of it. And this traditional thesis, what I call the negative view of the relationship between law and revolution, can be somehow challenged by what I wish to propose today. And it is something I'm currently working on to to build up a research project about this topic. So this thesis I wish to demonstrate, or I wish to put forward at least, is that such a relationship between law and the revolutionary process can be viewed in positive terms, which means that the revolution is not just a process that results in the formation of the law, but is a legal process itself. So it can be included somehow in the sphere of the juridical, and by implication, this would modify. This would implicate a modification, a change in the way we see the law, because in this way the law should be seen as should be captured in its changing, in its dynamic nature, and not just in its formal and static display. So I think we can tackle this thesis by two main approaches. The one is the dialectic or idealist approach that we can find in the Marxist literature, or in the Hegelian approach, or the Hegelian studies. So according to the dialectic approach, we might argue that there is contradiction indeed between the formal law and the revolution, but this contradiction would be ultimately mediated, and then it would make the law emerge in another characterization. So it would emerge the law in its motional virtue, or his evolutional virtue. But this is not what I would like to talk today about. Is the second approach is what I would like to deal with today. It is what I call the historicist of the pluralist approach, that appears somehow compatible with the phenomenon, the intellectual phenomenon of institutionalism. So the theory of the law as institution. And in general, for this theory, we might argue that institution is a social unit that forms norms and legal structures and power relationships. And according to some of the most illustrious continental authors that supported this thesis, so institution is the basis of the legal order. So we might infer that in case we classify the revolutionary phenomena as an institution, then we would include revolution in the legal discourse according to this institutional theory. I think that this approach could be developed starting from the 20th century legal institution. I will go very quick on this because I'm afraid I would take too long. So, like the early institutionalists, especially Maurice Rieu and Santi Romano, two popular continental authors, they both observed that there are multiple groups and institutions in society, especially Rieu. According to Rieu, each institution had its own legal significance by itself and not by the recognition that would be issued by the state. So every institution is somehow independent from the legal provisions of the state. And therefore, I mean, there are many interesting characteristics of Orio's model of institution, but I don't have time to discuss them. But one thing I would like to focus on now is that his model of institution is mostly based on the characteristics of the state, even though he claims that every institution is, as per its significance, independent of the state. At the same time, Orio devised this model drawing from the characteristic of the state's legal order. And this was noted by the Italian author I mentioned some minutes ago, which is Santi Romano. According to Romano, in fact, the institution, so the idea of institution, should be applied to every social group that is organized. So it is the organization, regardless of the form or the peculiar structure that it takes, it is the organization that makes for the origin of the legal order. And this is peculiarly Santi Romano's approach to the legal pluralist conception. And because he devises this plurality of legal order, and then he devised also the different types of interrelationship between interrelations between different groups and different orders, because every order can be considered illegal and deemed illegal and declared pronounced so by the state, and yet exist in the legal domain as a legal order. So it would be legally significant even though the state would reject it. And in this sense, revolution is an institution for Santi Romano. In one of his latest works, The Fragments of a Legal Dictionary, that he published that it was published right after his death, Santi Romano expressly claimed that revolution is a regulated movement that is endowed with its own law. And in this sense, he makes room for the social dimension of conflict in the legal discourse, in the legal domain. And I think it would be interesting to see if this sort of analysis, this sort of conception would be somehow, could be somehow ascribed to the most prominent proponents of the so-called movement of Italian theory in political philosophy. I don't know how many of you know about this so-called movement of Italian theory. It is a complex movement, so of course we don't have time to discuss its characteristics, but you must know that it originated from the working class movements in Italy during the 1960s and 1970s. And one of his most important early theorists was Mario Tronti, who was inspired by Marxist philosophy, and he reflected on the autonomy of labor forces, claiming that proper autonomy could not be obtained by seeking recognition from the legal order of the state. That was the strategy that was pursued by the trade unions. But proper autonomy, in the true sense of this word, would implicate the continuity of antagonism. So without antagonism, the labor forces would have been ultimately absorbed by the legal order of the state, and then their potential would have been neutralized. And I guess this idea of the hidden potential, of the unexpressed potential, is the main core of what currently is called Italian theory. So the idea that there is an exceedance, in Italian the word is eccedenza, an exceedance, an expressed potential that can overcome the wanted forms of the institutions. I believe most of you are familiar with Antonio Negri's works on the multitude and the constituent power. So that was one instance of the idea of this idea of a potential that lies in the multitude. It cannot be totally absorbed by the state. It can, in any moment, can try to overcome it by expressing in new forms, in new institutions. And over the latest decade, how many minutes have I left? 6 more? Brilliant. Okay, I'm about to finish. Okay, so over the latest decades, the relationship between political institutions and this concept of exceedance or potential was interestingly emphasized by two of the most important authors at the moment in this group of the Italian theorists in political philosophy, Giorgio Agamben and Roberto Esposito, who are also the most translated, worldwide authors. So Agamben, in his monumental work that is Homo Sacer, published between 1995 and 2015, he devised this idea of modal ontology. According to Agamben, modal ontology means that the institutions, these institutions of politics shape not just the social significance of subjects, but their ways of being, their modalities of being. So that is the origin of the name modal ontology. But he claims also that he argued also that human beings are able to deactivate the pressure of institutions by expressing this sort of potential outside the language of politics. This is what he calls a potenza destituente. It is a destituent might, or we might translate it by destituent potential or destituent might. So what I aim to stress is that Agamben claims that this potential lies not in the political side, in the political or in the legal discourse, but outside of it, in what he calls the impolitical or the unpolitical. Whereas Roberto Esposito recently reflected on the concept of institution, drawing from Horiu and Romano that I mentioned at the beginning, and he argued that potential is not expressed through the impolitical, by the idea of potenza destituente, but through that political. So according to Esposito, life needs to be socially constituted, and in this sense, institutions are not just able to express and neutralize social conflict, but he's persuaded that institutions are able to express the dynamics of conflict by their transformative attitude. So with their transformation, they can express the conflictual instances and conflictual forces. In this sense, we might say that institution has at least a double meaning. On the one hand, the term institution addresses the result of the normative process. And on the other hand, the word institution names the process itself, the process that underlies a project of forming a new normative framework. And by this project, it underlies already a normative potential. In this sense, revolution can be institution in this dynamic and diachronic sense, because it implicates this idea of the normative project underlying. So, which is basically the purpose to achieve, or in Horiuan language, it could be the guiding idea of an institution. And then I will conclude with some critical remarks on this sort of idea, because so this was just one side of the problem, of the one possible strategy of approach to the law relationship institution. So this institutional idea of revolution, on the one hand, brings about no real contradiction. In other words, it hides the contradiction, because in considering the revolution as an institution, the historical evolution would appear just as one, like a whole continuum. The temporal subversion of the replacement between one institution and another. So there would be no space for the real contradiction in this conceptualization. And ultimately, since, at least according to Esposito, since it is the political, so the pressure of institution that expresses the conflict, and make the conflict emerge, we would have, I wonder if this process of institutionalization wouldn't wind up neutralizing the potential that was aimed to express. So I'll leave you with this, like open questions, and I hope you have questions if you want. Thank you.
No. Thanks so much, Pierre. That was really, really fascinating, and it's really exciting because I think there's going to be so many crossovers across all the different speakers on all the panels. So that was really great. This is Professor Alex Prichard, who is Professor of International Political Theory at Exeter.
Simon's just gone to the loo, but the sharing's not turned on, unfortunately, so I can't load my slides onto Zoom. He's just gone to the loo. I mean, I can project them here. You should be able to see that, but they're not going to be able to see it online because I can't share. But as soon as he comes back, I'll share it online.
So we'll do that.
Can you try again and just change the...
Try again. Awesome.
Yes.
There we go. Perfect. Okay.
Oh, wait. I still have this on me. Where is Simon, by the way? Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So thankfully, or unsurprisingly perhaps, my presentation follows very neatly from what's just come. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about sovereignty and anarchy as concepts in classical anarchist thought. What this is really an introduction to a book. We were offered the contract by Cambridge University Press on Monday. The book is called Constitutionalizing Anarchy, and it's co-authored with Ruth Kinna. It's the product of 10 years of work, 5 or 6 different grants, lots of participant action research, and I'm delighted to be able to present this to you today. What I'm going to present is a synopsis of chapter 3 that you can see here. So essentially what the book does is a single case study in anarchist constitutionalizing. And what we do is we trace the theory from the 1840s all the way through to the present, and we change the focus as we go through the book from the theoretical, because of course the early anarchist movement was broadly an intellectual movement, into a more practical movement from the turn of the 20th century, looking in particular at the IWW, who are an anarchistic group, and we look at the tensions and problems they have by not declaring themselves anarchists, through to the Occupy Wall Street movement, and then finally to our favored group, our only vision of success in the book, and that is Radical Roots, who have been decommodifying property for the last 30 years, and probably arguably the most successful, I would say, social movement in modern times for that very reason. And I finish with a theory of everyday revolutionary constitutionalism, which I think has pretty much just been summarized in the previous presentation. It was really great to hear, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that paper in print. Okay, so very quickly then, this is how I'm going to do this. I'm going to be looking at critique of constitutionalism, the general aversion to anarchy, which I'm hoping these first two parts won't be a surprise, so I'll whiz through them. A little bit more time on three key parts of the concept of anarchy for anarchists: culture, social power, and then anarchy and constituent power, which I'll close on. Then, if I've got time, I'll talk about Kelsen and talk about anarchy as a Grundnorm before I come back to more general questions. Okay, so you'll, I hope, be familiar with three broad literatures. The first is this argument that the spread of Western constitutions constitutes liberal cultural material and economic imperialism, and this new constitutionalism spread through multilateral organizations from the WTO through the UN and onwards is a bad thing. And there is this literature known as the New Constitutionalism, written up by Gill and Cutler in 2014, is a critique of the constitutional literature that we try and build on. We're also very aware of Martin Lachlan, for example, who has a much more principled legal theory critique of constitutionalism, arguing that the ideology of law is, and particularly constitutionalism, elides, subverts, represses the power of the people, and this is a key problem for him. We're also very cognizant of that issue. And then finally, a general discussion within the wider political theory literature around the constituent power and its relationship to the constituted power or the state. And typically what we argue is that none of these literatures go far enough. And actually, if you push them all to their conclusion, you get to anarchism, and that's what we're trying to defend. So, very quickly, what's a constitution, just so that we're all on the same page here? We think it's more than just who defines who can make the rules, apply them, and how. So we see constitutionalism, much as it's just been described here as an institution, we think of it in four key aspects. So it's declarative statements with the people, preambles, and so on that sort of define a culture, rules and regulations that dictate how those sorts of rules and regulations can be changed and so on, also the institutions that are part of that political community, and the different decision-making procedures that allow people to come to agreement within that. But each of those four parts are primarily geared towards challenging and rebalancing power. So constitutionalizing is a process. Constitutionalism seems to have no historical temporality, at least as far as I understand the literature. It's almost a sort of a Borg-like spread. What we're trying to describe is the actual process through which constitutions are written and enacted. And we're very keen to highlight that because it's central to an anarchist politics. So an anarchist constitution is all of those things. And it might surprise you to hear that absolutely every anarchist, well, absolutely, I say every anarchist that spent any time in a group that defines itself in any particular way, and there are many of them, does all of these things. And we've spent a lot of time with a lot of anarchist groups, and everyone affirms that general observation. Anarchists constitutionalize routinely, as do we all. So this, of course, runs against the grain of established thinking. Hart and Negri, for example, who consider themselves to be these sort of radical, but they're not that radical at all, think that essentially anarchists, all they do is shout and have loud slogans and so on, but they've got nothing really constructive to offer because they've never really theorized the relationship of the people to the state. They're just resentful. Catherine Malibu, who is, on the face of it, a much more sympathetic reader of anarchism, currently the Derrida chair, holds Derrida's chair at UCLA, has argued something similar, but from a more philosophical point of view. So in her book, Stop Thief, she's very keen to show us that Agamben and Rancière and the others are essentially stealing anarchist concepts, but she declines to demonstrate that anarchists already had a theory, and so arguably is a thief herself. So she argues that anarchism, or the anarchist, the classical anarchist literature, simply unable to explain its ontological dimension. And not only that, but refuses to. And why do they do that? Well, as is common in most of the anarchist literature, most anarchists say that most anarchists don't do theory. Okay, this is a general aversion to intellectualizing anarchy and anarchism, in theory, at least as far as most people that you ask. And what anarchism is it's a practical politics. You don't need to think about it, you just do it. And this is so deeply ingrained. I mean, hopefully these are well-known names to you. If they're not, you probably don't know the anarchist literature as well as I do, but Cathy Ferguson is a key writer in this tradition. So I want to debunk all of those positions, and that's what the book does. Now then, at the heart of our account of anarchy is a conception of social ontology that is fundamentally indeterminate. And that might not surprise you, because that's common to a lot of sociological philosophical positions. We take this directly from the primary literature, so we go back to the 19th century and demonstrate that this stuff is all there in the writings of the anarchists from the 1840s through to the early 1900s. First person we look at is Proudhon. Proudhon makes a distinction between two definitions of power in the French language, puissance and pouvoir. And to distinguish them very quickly for you, puissance is a force or capacity that inheres in a thing. So rocks have puissance by virtue of their inertia, but also groups that exercise material force have puissance. That, however, is unthinking. What Proudhon's really interested in is what he calls pouvoir. And pouvoir is a conscious, associative, intentional form of social action that is constituted through the intermingling of peoples, through the assertion of your individuality in a group, through the assertion of the group by virtue of the demonstrable support of individuals. So you might say that this is a sort of French civic version of the more Germanic cultural approach. So Rudolf Rocker, who's a very close reader of Proudhon, once boasted he'd read everything, including all his letters, defines culture in similar ways, but does it for different reasons. So for Rudolf Rocker, then, culture is any form of social act, or the issue, the outcome, the product of all social interactions. As we interact with one another, we produce culture. We're producing one in this room now. And this occurs, it's ubiquitous in society, of course. And the aim of this is to show that all social groups not only can create their own culture, but that culture is indeterminate because we are always members of different groups. And so we have split loyalties. And those split loyalties are integral to understanding the indeterminacy of both culture, and I'll get onto law in a second. But Rocker had a very clear object of attack, and that was the emerging fascist state in 1930s Germany. So what we see in 1930s Germany then is the emergence of a doctrine of the totalitarian state where all social groups are subservient to the state and all forms of culture are subservient to high culture, defined also by the state. So you can see here that what we're seeing is a validation prior to the emergence of totalitarianism, a validation of that indeterminacy that is central to defending the autonomy of political groups and of individuals. Those of you that know anything about constitutional theory ought to be able to hear the ideas of Gunther Tübner here. We can't demonstrate any obvious link between the two. There's no indication that Tübner had actually read any of the anarchists, but the work that he lent on most heavily, Otto von Guercke's works, these were central, written in the same period, and these have been translated actually. Harold Lasky and others took Maitland's translation. So these are common roots of a similar problem. Okay, for those of you who don't know, Gunther Tübner's sociological constitutionalism echoes many of the ideas I've just described. So, who cares? So the interesting thing about this, I think, is that it really problematizes the notion of a constituent power. Okay, traditionally you can only have a constitution that is buttressed by a people who can enact it. And the problem that we have if we take this radical indeterminacy and this view of culture and of social power that I've just outlined is that there cannot be a constituent power large enough to justify a state form of polity, okay, or to justify or underpin the Constitution. And this was centrally Proudhon's focus in War and Peace. In War and Peace, he wrote extensively about the ways in which people power, for want of a better word, always disrupt and destroy the established order. So I strongly recommend you have a look at that because I think it's exactly what you were talking about earlier. So the Constitution is always pluralized by the right to war. And by the right to war, Proudhon doesn't just mean the fighting, but he means that social conflict, the dynamism that gives politics its life. Likewise, anti-colonial struggles in Ireland and Wales and India. I always get upset when people forget that the British state is a colonial state internally as much as it is externally. These are examples of the rejection of the European state-building project. They're central to the constitution of Europe. Okay, they're revolutionary processes that give us what we take to be the status quo. The problem for, let's say, the Occupy Wall Street movement or for the American Constitution is the notion that somehow we, the people, or we are the 99%, can have any traction in social ontology. Those groupings simply don't exist. There is no 99%. And what we do in our chapter on the Occupy Wall Street movement is demonstrate exactly how problematic that slogan became, particularly when they attempted to decolonize Oakland. But we the people is equally problematic. There is no people. But of course, this anarchist approach is more realistic, but it's also hugely challenging. Okay, because the constituent power is always foundationalist. You might say, oh, I've heard that before. The anarchists were saying this in the 1840s. We hear this again and again over the last 50, 60 years, mainly because most people don't read anarchism. So I think I've got a little bit more time, haven't I? Okay, 7 minutes. Okay, I'm whipping through here. I hope this literature is broadly familiar to you. Now, all of this, I think, allows us to argue that anarchy can be a Grundnorm. Now, I'm not going to explain what a Grundnorm is, not now, but I just want to say that what Kelsen was arguing, Kelsen wanted to show that all law is essentially indeterminate and contingent. And it's contingent in two ways, materially. The is contingent, because all state law is contingent on the international balance of power, which means it's contingent upon the state's right to war. And if a right to war exists, at least normatively, implicitly, in jus gentium, there can be no solid foundation to law. Likewise, if you take the ought of law seriously, actually, he agrees with Kant, and Proudhon says the same, as do most anarchists, that there is no rational foundation for any normative statement. That doesn't make them any less valuable. In fact, if we take the concept of culture seriously, it's precisely what makes our groups important. But if we take that seriously, it means that all normative values are contingent, but nonetheless important. Okay? In other words, anarchy is the epistemic and ontological foundation of law. It's anarchy that underpins the possibility of law, not sovereignty. Just going to skip to the end here. So Kelsen's statement where he says, even an anarchist, if you're a professor of law, could describe positive law as a system of law. Typically, this is used in two ways, either to demonstrate that anarchists are idiots, or to make an empirical claim about whether anarchists can actually have a view on law. And usually people say, oh, they can't because they're idiots. And so this generally is considered to be a statement of Kelsen's realism. You can read it in a third way, and that is as a factual statement about what anarchists actually do. So anarchists do routinely consider law to be not only possible, but also flawed. And the project of politics is not to disband of law entirely, but to find a system of law and a constitutional architecture within which you can develop it that is non-dominating. So actually Kelsen's right. You can be an anarchist and you can not only defend a system of law that is valid, but you can also reject that which you do not find valid. And the point of an anarchist is to do that. So very quickly, oh, still got 4 minutes. Oh, not that quickly then. Okay, I'll slow down. Right. Constitutional political theorist Jim Tully and Genevieve Newtons, who is constitutional legal theorist, both very interesting and got a lot of time for both. Now, Jim Tully, famous for trying to find a constitutional solution to the problem of multiculturalism in Canada. And the issue that he had was that the Canadian Constitution did not permit of the multiculturalism and the rights of Indigenous communities. And he argued that if you historicize the Constitution, and can demonstrate its imperial and colonial underpinnings, you recognize that, and then you recognize the communities through which or rather you recognize the communities that have been expropriated, it is possible to include and to develop a more progressive constitution on the outside. Genevieve Newton, and I'll come back to why this is problematic in a second, but Genevieve Newton says something relatively similar, but from a different point of view. So she says that the problem with this concept of destituent power, which is just heard of here, which she identifies with the anarchists, in particular Saul Newman, so the problem with this is it's a great disruptive force, but it can't produce anything. Okay, and so what we're left with then is a tension. Historicizing simply gives us an opportunity to reclaim what we've already got, but accepting that the anarchists exist simply destroy it, and there's nothing progressive we can gain. Now, this is typical in the literature, and it's completely false. It's a false dichotomy, but it's also factually false because it doesn't represent what the anarchists actually thought. Not that I'm saying that Jim Tully is saying this directly to the anarchists, but you can hear the defense of the Canadian Constitution against those more radical plans that would seek to get rid of it entirely. The point is, for the anarchist at least, is that you have, in recognizing the multiplicity that is central to Jim Tully's project, and in recognizing the destituent force of the anarchist, you are then obliged to recompose your constitution, or at least accept that sovereignty cannot be the underpinning principle that governs its jus. Sovereignty precludes the very thing that the recognition of multiplicity and of change or evolution would suggest is necessary for the vitality of that constitution in the first place. We argue that it's got to be pushed to anarchism. So I'll put the plan of the book up again in a second. Oh, actually, no, I won't, because we're moving on to the next. I'll bring that up in Q&A if you like. But very quickly. So the anarchist social ontology suggests that sovereignty is impossible. I hope I've made that fairly clear. You may say, well, that's not very original because everyone's been doing that. I think what we try and do is demonstrate that there's a practical politics that comes out of that, which you do not find in the current post-structuralist literature. Even most of the radical Marxist literature doesn't have a positive politics. It doesn't recommend new constitutions. For example, Hart and Negri's assembly has surprisingly little to say about what an assembly would look like. So anarchy is then the de facto, de jure, and de facto, is the de facto and the de jure grundnorm of politics and law. In international politics, we know that anarchy is the de facto legal, the de jure, getting confused, I'm running out of time and I'm getting flustered. Okay, so anarchy is the de jure principle of order in the international domain, there being no single sovereign. What we're arguing, and what the anarchists have argued, is that anarchy ought to be the de jure principle that governs politics in toto. Constituent power, then, is misdirection. There's never a general subject of law or constituting power, only millions of collectives, billions of individuals trying to manage their often violent interrelations. So in the rest of the book, we look to decentralized federalism as the solution to this. And argue that anarchy is not just for anarchists, it's for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. That was brilliant. So next we have Dr. Simon Thorpe. He is a lecturer in law at the University of Westminster, and he researches post-Marxist approaches to constitutionalism and social movements.
I was going to get the lapel mic. Okay, where should I put this? Here. To here. And slides to go. The way. Okay. Sorry, I'm just seeing the Zoom not showing what I expected it to show. Marcus, do you know why the Zoom is showing between reform and grassroots revolution?
I'm trying to.
I know. Oh, I know. Stop sharing and then share again.
Okay. Yeah.
And share this one. And that should come in a second. Amazing, brilliant. I'll also say I'm seeing people are finally joining the live stream. I think that's happening now because this is to the live stream more than people in the room. There was a bit of a confusion with the scheduling. We didn't realize that we didn't think about the fact that we're on British summertime now, not GMT. So until this morning, the new systems convergence schedule had us an hour off from when we actually started. So apologies to those who have joined the stream late through no fault of your own if you didn't see that in time. Anyway, check my clicker's working. There we go. So yes, I'm Simon Thorpe, lecturer at the University of Westminster. I am so in love with the fact that this panel has come together in this way because the synergies are just far too perfect. The idea I'm going to be trying to explain to you today, prefigurative constitutionality, comes very directly out of deep engagement with the work of Tony Negri, who thankfully has come up both positively and negatively so far. Through that, I end up arriving, I think, we can discuss how true this is later, but at, I think, a similar sort of endpoint to what Alex and Ruth have been working on, but within this post-Marxist Negrian framework, more than an anarchist framework. And of course, this is how these debates always go. You know, if you look at the debates between Negri and Michael Hart on the one hand, and John Holloway on the other, with anarchists, you know, you always see that they end up converging on basically agreeing on everything, but except for the terminology or the semantics or whatever, or, you know, very subtle questions of strategy. And that's indeed what I find so interesting about autonomous Marxism. It's kind of an anarchist politics, but with this, what I think is a very helpful Marxist framework around that. I'm not actually going to talk much about Negri in my presentation, but maybe we can get into that in the questions. What I am going to try and do is explain what this idea of prefigurative constitutionality is. So this is sort of the main conceptual proposal that emerged from my PhD, which I finished in 2021, but I'm finally going to try and publish something on this idea soon. So I'm challenging myself today to try to explain to you kind of my whole PhD in 20 minutes, but hopefully I've condensed things down to make that a manageable task. So what is this idea of prefigurative constitutionality? I'm going to try to explain. Let's break it down. This slide is kind of laying the ground for the structure of the presentation to come. Some of these things will be explained more later. Some will be mostly explained now. So prefiguration, I don't think you mentioned the word prefiguration, did you, Alex, in the whole presentation? So that comes from, more or less, from anarchist politics. And my concept of prefigurative constitutionality largely comes from trying to think through this idea of prefiguration. What actually is it? What does this concept actually mean within a Negrian more than anarchist framework? And I'll sort of walk through various different definitions of it before arriving at what I think is actually by far the best or most useful definition, which is essentially path dependence, but very much overlapping with more classic definitions such as means-ends unity, or as it often appears very unsatisfyingly in some literature, it's often just used to refer to just what prefigurative politics, i.e. anarchism, the nonviolent direct action movements of the 70s and onwards, the ultra-global movement of the squares, 15M, etc. Before about 2015, 2012-ish, very often definitions, quote unquote, of prefiguration were just kind of what these groups do. And it was only after that point that you started to get a lot more very interesting literature really trying to nail down an actual useful definition of prefiguration and some typologies, and sort of adding to that literature in parts with this concept of prefigurative constitutionality, because I think it's not just a novel concept, it also helps us to reflect differently on the concept of prefiguration itself, and indeed on the idea of constitutionality. Speaking of which, why am I using this sort of pretentious word rather than just going with the standard constitutionalism? That's because I want a much broader concept that refers to having a constitutional quality, i.e. being a set of rules, principles, or mechanisms that define a political community without being tied to sovereignty, actually. Another beautiful connection, I think, between our papers. Because I think constitutionalism is an inherently sovereignist concept, inherently sovereignist. I would sometimes use the word process here, but actually Alex made a very good point. I think I agree with that. There's very little kind of process thinking in constitutionalism, and that's part of one of the many problems with it. And indeed, process philosophy, from Marx to Negri and far beyond, is also a sort of key part of my thinking around prefigurative constitutionality. So constitutionality, yeah, evokes something much broader, which could include, for example, things that are far outside, obviously outside of the realms of constitutionalism and sovereignty, such as the possibility of a non-sovereign democracy, or what my former PhD supervisor, Ilan Wall, who's wandering around the corridor somewhere, called an open constituent power, which he assigns an interest to not just Negri, but also Agamben, even Ernesto Laclau, Paulo Verno, Enrique Dussel, and others. Like I said, Negri was the key influence on my thinking here. And so in Negrian terms, it's about the possibility of a constituent power that is never closed in the form of constituted power. It remains open as an ongoing, inherently prefigurative process of democracy. But that's just one possible form of prefigurative constitutionality that you might be able to comprehend within this framework by broadening it out beyond constitutionalism. I think it actually also applies far beyond anarchism or autonomous Marxism or prefigurative politics I haven't quite answered this for myself yet, exactly how far it extends, but potentially to any politics, maybe, to the extent that political organization lays down path dependencies that shape the future, such that we can define, finally, getting to the core definition, we can define prefigurative constitutionality in its simplest as the strategic connection between present organizational means and future constitutional ends. You'll notice I'm using the language of means ends unity, which should be familiar to anyone familiar with prefiguration, and fusing it with this constitutional idea that there is a future society which must be constituted somehow, that is being prefigured here and now in the present organization of grassroots politics. And therefore we can, and I think should, think constitutionally about non-state grassroots politics, and also think prefiguratively about constitutions and constitutional theory. So that's what I'm going to go into more detail in for the rest of the presentation. I forgot to set a timer. I like to see how long I have. So I've got 13 more minutes. I've got 13 more minutes. Okay. So a little history lesson for those who don't remember that it was, my God, 14 years ago now that this formative moment for me politically happened in 2011. Maybe some of you are even too young to even remember this happening the first time around. Hate being reminded of how old I'm getting. But back in 2011, we had this really earth-shattering prefigurative moment in world politics. You had a kind of an exodus from party politics, from state politics, although interestingly, stemming from a very classic kind of state-oriented form of who is it? Is it Tully who coined the term contentious politics? Tilly? Is it Tilly or Tully? One of them. That's it. So stemming from more classic forms of contentious politics, anti-austerity protests in Greece and Spain, inspired in part by the Arab Spring, and the occupation of Tahrir Square in Cairo, and this sort of tent city that erupted, which also happened to share a kind of a prefigurative tent community repertoire with the ultra-global movement, who'd been doing similar things for years at their anti-summit protests, going to the World Trade Organization meetings or whatever, setting up these massive tent communities, organized prefiguratively and horizontally, and then going and trying to disrupt those summits. I don't know actually how closely the structure of those tent communities was replicated in Cairo, but I know in what became known as the movements of the squares, 15M in Spain, what's the Greek for indignados? I don't remember. Anyway, the Greek indignados, etc. They ended up occupying city squares like Puerta del Sol in Madrid, and in their case, very closely following that repertoire from the ultra-global movement. So really part of this classic prefigurative politics heritage, ultra-global movement before, nonviolent direct action before that, classical anarchism before that. In America, you had the same thing, kind of starting as not so much anti-austerity, but anti-corruption protests, and then the occupation of city squares, the Occupy movement, etc., all characterized by a very distinct and actually remarkably coherent and consistent repertoire of organization, consensus decision-making in assemblies that are free and open to anyone. This whole kind of repertoire, I'm overusing the word repertoire, but it fits too well, of hand signals that those who remember 2011 will remember all too well. And so at this point, yeah, prefigurative politics really sort of smashed into the mainstream discourse. Capitalism was brought back on the discursive menu, I think, thanks to Occupy in large part. And from that tradition as a whole, I keep mentioning, you get this idea of, quote, prefigurative politics, assembly democracy, consensus decision-making, some sense of horizontalism. That's a term that comes out of Argentina and their assembly movements from 2001. Safer spaces policies were a really common phenomenon that I thought I might research at one point, and that was a key part of my very early thinking around sort of prefiguration and law, because there's a kind of a prefigurative approach to rights and dispute resolution going on in these safer spaces policies that were very common across the sort of prefigurative movements of the early 2000s. So you have this tradition of prefigurative politics. And as I said, some literature for a long time was very unsatisfying in trying to actually define what it is that they are doing in a sort of at a theoretical level. What is prefiguration? It can't just be what these groups do. It can't just be consensus decision-making. I found Yuri Gordon's article from 2018 really helpful in specifying this. It's from him that I take the idea of prefiguration as path dependence. I also like his way of explaining that we can see prefiguration in the absolutely most abstract sense as a temporal framing. It defines a temporal relationship between usually present and future, although ultimately it comes from Christian theology and the temporal connection between past and present and future. So this is where you first really see the term prefiguration being used. Eric Auerbach was crucial, I think, in popularizing this sort of reading of it, but you can see in writings from people like St. Jerome in the 4th century or 5th century, talking about how they're kind of rereading, reimagining the Hebrew Bible as now the Old Testament, which prefigures the predestined coming of Christ, etc. So that explains why we take this temporal framing in the form of the term prefiguration, and then apply it to politics. Gordon argues that you can typologize it into two, recursive or generative. And so he says the Christian theology uses prefiguration in a recursive way because it's the prefiguration of a fixed end. The end is predetermined, and therefore it becomes a kind of a recursive process in the sense of if I had, screen sharing that sort of replicates off infinitely. in a kind of Hall of Mirrors style, right? That kind of sense of recursive. Gordon, being an anarchist, argues that Marxism is also a form of recursive prefiguration to the extent that it includes sort of prefigurative temporal framings, because there's a predetermined end. I think that's actually an unfair and or outdated reading of Marx and Marxism. I think we now understand much more about Marx's interest in various forms of prefiguration, not just capital prefiguring socialism, but also sort of the prefigurative power of the Russian communes and things like that. But that's by the by. He prefers, and I prefer, a generative understanding of prefiguration, i.e. the prefiguration of partially indeterminate ends. It's not predetermined, it's a process. And again, as I said, process philosophy is crucial to my thinking around this. And of course, Gordon, being an anarchist, says that's what anarchism does, that's why anarchism is better than Marxism. So from there, we get the absolute classic definition of prefigurative politics from Karl Boggs, although he doesn't call it prefigurative politics yet. That comes a few years later from Winnie Breams. He calls it the prefigurative tradition. And interestingly, he assigns it not just to anarchism, but also to forms of Marxism, especially Andre Gors and others. Sort of establishing from the very beginning that prefiguration clearly is a much broader concept than the narrowly anarchist and anarchic, quote unquote, prefigurative politics that it's usually assigned to, which is part of what I sort of tried to pick up and run with in thinking about prefiguration more broadly. How much time do I have left? Oh God. So hurrying up very quickly. So from that, you get sort of there's two broad parts to that classic definition from Boggs. Means ends unity as the sort of imminent or immediate creation of alternatives. The classic version of that is IWW, the International Workers of the World, in their constitution. Interestingly, they actually call it a constitution, so you've got some sort of very explicit prefigurative constitutionality going on there, I think, forming the structure of the new society and the shell of the old. But then also this idea of means ends unity. I'm going to go into this quote in a future slide, so I'll come back to that. But what none of these definitions quite answer still is why. Why should we do this? One answer from Benjamin Franks, a card-carrying anarchist, he frames it as an ethical question. So he really focuses on the means ends unity part. And he sees it as a prefigurative ethic, which is not the individualism of rights-based deontology, although it might seem very similar to that in a lot of instances. And indeed, in very extreme cases, you get what Murray Bookchin denounced as lifestyle anarchism, this utterly presentist form of so-called prefigurative politics, which I would argue is not in fact political at all, as I'll explain on the next slide. He says this prefigurative ethic is also not the, quote, oppressiveness of consequentialism. It's rather an anti-hierarchical virtue ethics that defined what he calls an anarchist tactical politics, which is anti-strategic, which is important because you might remember I defined prefigurative constitutionality as the strategic connection between present organizational means and future organizational ends. So I need to be able to justify why Franks is wrong to claim that prefiguration is inherently anti-strategic and why you can actually speak of prefigurative strategy. And in fact, I think you have to be able to speak of prefigurative strategy. And here I'm a big fan of Jeremy Gilbert's kind of takedown of this anti-strategy position, because he points out, and I very much agree, that any politics to be defined as such must seek to change or reinforce existing power relationships in some more or less generalizable way, and therefore must have some kind of, quote, orientation towards the future, which must be strategy. I don't see any other way to define that. And so to talk about an anti-strategic politics or prefigurative politics is an oxymoron, I would say. Frank specifically identifies or defines strategy as a singular central problematic whose successful outcome resolves all problems. I think what you have here is a fairly arbitrary definition of strategy as just automatically authoritarian, which I think is obfuscatory of the truly strategic nature of prefigurative politics, or political prefiguration, as I prefer to call it, to sort of separate it from that very narrow anarchic tradition. And hence why I'm defining prefigurative constitutionality as the strategic connection between present organizational means and future constitutional ends. So what is prefigurative strategy? Here we have some examples from the Jura Federation when they split from the Marxists at the infamous Hague Convention of the International Working Men's Association. Emma Goldman echoing a similar idea. I'm going to focus on this one. They say in the Familiar Circular, trying to take down the authoritarian, cynical Marxist manipulations in the Working Men's Association. They say, how can we expect an egalitarian and free society to emerge from an authoritarian organization? It's impossible. This is the classic statement of that means ends unity idea, but it still doesn't quite explain why. And in picking this apart, I think we can really understand why I'm arguing that we should think of prefiguration as path dependence. Because if we pick that apart, you see there's the positive argument that our means should reflect our ends, and that could be explained in Franks's ethical way, or it could be defined in a strategic way. To define it in a strategic way, I think it's useful to think through to the next step. There's the negative argument, obviously. They're saying instrumental politics doesn't work. It's impossible. You see that again and again. John Holloway harks on this again and again, saying, look at history. Instrumental politics has never worked. But there's a further argument that's nearly always implicit, except in the case of Yuri Gordon and a couple of others. There's this implicit ontological argument about the nature of social change, that present means do in fact influence, constrain, or even determine future outcomes, which sounds quite banal. And yet people have been debating this idea under the heading of path dependence for many years. I'll wrap up in 30 seconds if I can. So we can think of prefigurative strategy as the strategic deployment of path dependence, and the prefigurative critique of instrumentalism as the accidental prefiguration of undesired ends, which takes us in all sorts of interesting directions that I don't have time to get into. So trying to wrap up, here we go, I'll end on this slide. So if prefigurative politics is the embodiment of future forms of blah, 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 including decision-making, crucially, as I've highlighted here, prefigurative organization is therefore not just mere organization, it is inherently and necessarily the imminent creation of that future society, as I said at the beginning, i.e. it is inherently constitutional. It's inherently prefiguring a new constitution, and the constitutional principles and mechanisms of that future constitution are already there, waiting to be studied in these groups. And that's what I did in my PhD. I did a case study on municipalism in Spain. I did all this. There you go. Don't have time to get into all of this, but this is sort of what I think the significance and utility of prefigurative constitutionality is when you apply it to a case study. You extract forms of emergent constitutional theory, essentially, from the case study. And I should shut up. Thank you. Now we need this.
Very much, Simon. That was really brilliant. Do we want to take off the slides so we can see them?
Yeah, that muted but on.
Or we just put it on?
Yeah. Turn this off so people aren't hearing me rustling.
Okay, so because of the streaming and the recording, we're going to give the microphone when you want to ask a question. And maybe we'll take a few questions, maybe 3, or see how many we've got and get some answers. Marcus?
I just told the
Okay.
that they can either raise their hands or write down questions.
Yeah. And we can give it a go, them speaking their question if they would like.
I think, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Just send people around.
Okay, so questions. Should we go you and then you? Yeah.
I'm presenting next. I'm going to ask my question and run away. So sorry for that. My question is, I thought all the presentations were wonderful, but I just have a...
Oh, I'm so sorry. Have you turned the microphone on?
Sorry.
My bad.
Yeah, in light of these 3 very wonderful presentations, I feel a bit bad because I'm going to ask only Alex a question, an extremely pedantic minor one, which does not do justice to what you said. And that is the quote of Kelsen that you projected about Kelsen's remark about even an anarchist can be a law professor and recognize what the law is and so on. And you said that that can be interpreted as a slight to to anarchists, or that they're not. I think you said 3 possible interpretations. I simply always, I want to suggest a 4th possibility, which is how I've always read that. Rather than Kelsen saying anything about anarchists, I would suggest that he was rather saying something about the law and about the ontological being or non-being of laws, and saying that, using an anarchist as an extreme example, to say that anyone can recognize what is the law or not, even perhaps with, I don't know, value judgment or not, even an anarchist. So I don't know if that, I think it helps your case, even such a reading, but yes.
Thank you so much for this thought-provoking session. I have questions and remarks for all of you. Pier Giuseppe.
I'm so
Yeah.
sorry. I should have said, speak into the microphone like this.
Oh, okay. Is it better?
It was a toilet roll. That was a specific advice we were given.
All right. I don't think I ever hold toilet roll like that, but okay. So I'm very much intrigued about, thinking of revolution as an institution and what it does entail, really. And you have taken us to a journey from the history of Italian Revolution as well, and I believe you refer to it as regulated movement. I think perhaps, and then you kind of mentioned workers' movements and especially through unionizing, it is still like in between place though. It is still illegal and legal, kind of hiding the illegal activity within its own legality. And I think perhaps this type of revolution is more speaking to national revolution in terms of Iranian revolution, in terms of French revolution and so on. But how does when I think of revolutions now, more like uprisings, they are more impromptu, they are more, there's an element of impossible to be regulated, and that is the heart of it, that is its power. So where is the institution in that, basically? And Alex, I look forward to reading the book, and congratulations on your book on socialism. Sorry, that was, I hope you take the humor in there, but what I mean by that is that perhaps there's an element of Western practice of anarchism and anarchist theory there that I don't necessarily see in every anarchist practice and every anarchist theory. So there is a very conscious effort of constantly undoing the law that is established within, especially when there's a shared living spaces, for example, a warehouse, a squad, and so on. Immediately when there's a kind of law establishes either as a self-destructive movement or an external kind of destructive force, that law that is established is constantly changes. I couldn't just read that temporality in what you have presented, and I wonder if you can say, I'm slightly concerned that ground Rome is too fixed for this project. Then that's why I made my dig. So I hope it makes sense now. But I do recognize that temporality in Simon's project, and however, I just want to perhaps kindly remind you Walter Benjamin's critique on means and ends relationship. And I'm just going to leave there because I don't want to burden you. Thank you very much for all these presentations.
Thanks. Do you want to maybe answer these questions and then, we could take another one if you can hold it in your head. Yeah. Okay, let's go to Marcus.
Thank you. This is going to be very weird because I hear myself from the from the online audience, and yeah. But basically, my question, thank you so much. This was such an interesting panel. And my question to you is, does revolution in revolutionary constitutionalism represent a value or a means to you, according to the views you just expressed? And I ask this because in challenging constituent power and constitutionalism in the terms of, for example, institutional or sovereign claims or prefigurative politics, are you guys focusing on the structure? And I mean here, in terms of positive law, constitutionalism, or are you focused on the legitimacy, like the value, the constitutionality, influenced perhaps by natural law notions? And I ask this conscious that I'm being the pragmatic in the room and influenced perhaps by, Tocqueville here saying that people who in an assembly or in a collective, people who want the means and the ends always win against those who want one thing or the other. Thank you.
Who would like to?
Alex has probably more to say in response to all of that.
So why do you want to? I mean, is this on? Yes, it is. Okay, just very quickly. Law is intelligible. That's all it is. That's all Kelsen was trying to say. I mean, I guess that's probably what Kelsen was trying to say. I don't disagree with that. But the thing is that if you look at the secondary interpretations of what Kelsen's trying to say, you more often than not you can read that as a slur in the secondary literature, and I think that's what I was trying to get at. So, I mean, I accept that, and that's I think what I was trying to say, that really the anarchists agree with that position, that you can recognize law, that law is intelligible. That's all he's trying to say, but that also means you can be critical of it, and that at least is both its ought and it is. In terms of the Grundnorm being too fixed, sorry, so bearing in mind that the Grundnorm we're defending here is anarchy, and anarchy has no necessary content. It is so for the anarchists, it is well, I mean, there's a part that there's a sort of an ontological argument to be had about this. Proudhon never really resolved it, but it's an anti-absolutist position. So anarchy is by necessity the opposite of fixing, and so if I haven't explained it properly or clearly enough, but the book certainly makes that argument. And then very quickly, is revolution a means or an end, a value or an end, right? Sorry, a value or a means. So I think in the book, our conclusion is that we are always already revolutionizing society through the groups that we create. And the focus of our book is on households, street protests, and workplaces. And through the collective organization of those three things, we generate new constituencies, we reconstitute society. So it is a prefigurative argument, but we don't use the word, I don't think, at any point in the book, because of some of the complexities that come with the concept, but also because I think there's a much longer tradition in the anarchist literature that can speak of these things without needing that concept. And we do it perhaps less through means ends, but more in terms of thinking about the generative forces of association.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
Which I thought links very neatly to what your presentation and the
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'll try being very quick. So thank you for the questions. I'll start with specifically about this idea of revolution as a regulated movement. So when I mentioned Romano's work, I didn't stress that that his conception seems not really enough to to the idea of revolution as institutional process, as institution in the sense of an institutional process, because when he addresses revolution as a movement, he's thinking probably about the revolutionary groups, so the organizational quality of revolutionary events. So in this case, I totally agree with you, because that definition is definitely not applicable to the events that we can face in contemporary times, because of course with a lot of impromptu revolutionary events or like insurgency, and so these sort of movements that are not that don't have the sort of organization in the sense that resembles an association or a group. It cannot be, they don't fit in this sort of conception. And yet I think we can define this idea of revolution as institution, not considering that as a group, but that event as I said, as a process. But here comes the how could I say, the point that you also stressed, that it cannot be regulated. But the point is that it should not be regulated. I mean, to me, it doesn't matter if it is regulated. I mean, more precisely, by the moment it gets regulated, that it ceases to be revolutionary at all. Because when it is regulated by something external, they are absorbed in the, in the present orders of meaning. So if they cannot be regulated, it means they can only try to be prefigurative. I guess I guess precisely in the sense that you stressed. Okay, I'm trying to sketch an answer to Marcus. I think well, I didn't think about the like how to classify my problematization of revolution. So I didn't try considering it either a value or a means. I was just trying to sketch it, to to consider the possibility of having it a sort of a technical category, so that could have implications on the way of considering law as something, a phenomenon that evolves in time and history, and not just as something formal that is linked to, like a specific, a static constitutional organization. But it is extremely intriguing, the question about legitimacy. So because it makes me think that legitimacy is a concept that we can apply only ex post facto. So like after an event has come to a certain result, then we can argue that that is legitimate or not. And I believe I mean, thank you, because I had never thought about this before this moment. So, and I also believe that also revolution can be categorized as revolution only ex post facto, because if it does not success, as Machiavelli would argue, if it has not success, that would have been just a violent event suppressed maybe in violence or not. But would not have been, that would not be a revolution if it has a certain result that we can categorize after the process has come to an end. So thank you. I mean, that's all that came to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. And sorry for towering over both of you. That chair is slightly outside of the camera for the stream, so I'm sitting here.
They don't know, but
exactly, yeah. So yeah, Jaylan, thank you. I don't remember actually Benjamin's critique of means and ends, so thank you for mentioning. I will look into it. I've always meant to read more Benjamin. He's not on my Derrida list of people I should read, but I don't want to, and I will never read. Benjamin is very much on my I want to read and I will eventually read list. So Marcus, am I conceiving of revolution as a means or as a value? I think, like Pierre, I don't have an answer, but I can explain why I don't have an answer. I think it's because so we named the stream Revolutionary Constitutionalism after a special issue of Global Social Challenges that's coming out soon-ish, maybe next year. And I think revolution is a concept that sits interestingly, inside my proposed concept of prefigurative constitutionality, but it's that way around rather than prefigurative constitutionality sitting inside the wider concept of revolution, i.e. it's not necessarily a revolutionary process that it defines. It defines as I kept saying, a sort of process-oriented view of social, legal, and constitutional change and emergence. And one possible version of that would be a revolutionary one, or one way to read a possible version of that would be, sorry, it's reminding me to set up the stream for the next session. Sorry, what was I saying? One way to read one possible version of prefigurative constitutionality would be as revolutionary. So that, I guess that would, yeah, you would have revolutionary prefigurative constitutionalities as one possible version of this phenomenon, right? And a Negrian politics would be a revolutionary prefigurative constitutionality, which seeks, as I said, an open constituent power, a form of non-sovereign democracy, and sees that as a prefigurative revolution, but still not the evental sort of classical vulgar Marxist model of revolution. So yeah, revolution sort of would fit in as one possible adjective within the various array, the array of various possible forms of prefigurative constitutionality, if that makes sense.
Thanks. I was going to say, I think we might have to finish there, unless it was really quick.
I just want to say one thing about revolution that I think is worth bearing in mind. So there's sort of 5 generations of revolution studies. I think one of the things that they've found is that, you know, if you could identify in advance what revolutionaries wanted, that would be a good enough piece of research. If you could then demonstrate that any of those gains had been achieved after the event, that would be an awesome piece of work, but nobody's been able to demonstrate that either. And what you find is that through that revolutionary process, not only are the aims of most revolutionaries scuppered by the practices that they engage in, but that actually it's impossible to determine ex post facto that there was a clear plan in the first place. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that revolutions can never then be prefigurative. Actually, they're always institutions, as we've heard, because revolutions become part of social change. And indeed, what you are determining a revolution by is not so much the ethos or the politics, but the means through which it's exercised. And invariably, those means are counterproductive because they generate precisely the countervailing forces that they're intending to overthrow, invariably are too weak, and therefore the revolution fails. So the vast majority of revolutions are abject failures. So either we stop talking about revolutions and think about it in the way that we've heard well, I hope in all 3 of these presentations, which I think is a more productive way of thinking about it, or we use the word in a radically different way. And I think if we think about it in terms of process and institution in the way that's been described, then actually we get a much clearer sense of the social processes that I'm always already emerging through association. But that is not revolution as it's classically understood. And I think that's where the vast majority of the confusion comes from. So perhaps one of the key things for us to take away from this is really we really need a better definition of revolution rather than of prefiguration necessarily or constitutionalism, because it's the concept of revolution that's going to be tripping us up every time. That's just my tuppence worth.
Okay, thanks so much.